Boom shakalaka, we're back. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is Wednesday, the 4th of November. Welcome to this episode of Live with Littlewood, live just before lockdown is imposed upon us in a few hours' time. As I say, it's November the 4th, so tomorrow's supposed to be the day of treason, gunpowder and plots, but there seems to be quite a lot of that in the air for the last few days and few weeks. We're going to have some great fireworks for you over the next 80 minutes or so. Coming up on today's programme, Reformed. This week, the Brexit Party announced plans to rebrand itself as Reform UK, positioning itself as the anti-lockdown party. It says it wants to give a political voice to opponents of the COVID-19 restrictions. We at the IA aren't involved in electoral politics or party politics, but we are interested in ideas and helping people see the world in a logical, free market way. What are the ideas of Reform UK? Will Reform UK just be a single issue party? What else will it bring to the table? Does it have any sort of ideology or narrative? I'll be asking its chairman in just a few minutes. Also coming up, the cost of COVID. England, as I speak, is just hours away from a second lockdown, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying there is no alternative. Is that really the case? Or, as I was quoted as saying earlier this week, same words as Donald Trump, the cure has actually become worse than the disease. And America decides, or does it? What does the voting in the US presidential election tell us so far? Crucially, how will America's final choice of president, and however they finally get to that choice, impact on the prospects of a trade deal between the US and the UK? All that and more to come. As ever, I'll be joined by a brilliant cast of commentators, journalists, think tankers from both sides of the pond, including later on in the show, from here in the UK, Brendan O'Neill, the editor of the online magazine Spiked, Dominic Frisby, financial writer and fantastically funny comedian, John Longworth, chairman of the Independent Business Network and former MEP, co-founder of Leave Means Leave, and independent forecaster and researcher Jonathan Kitson. From across the water, we'll be joined by John Tillman, the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute, and Michael Carnuccio, founder of the Oklahoma City-based JTK Group. And also from the home team, I'm delighted I'll be joined by Annabel Denham, our Director of Communications here at the IEA. They're all going to be with us later. First up, delighted to welcome back onto the show Richard Tice, businessman, chairman of the newly rebranded Reform UK, formerly the Brexit Party, founder of the campaign groups Leave Means Leave and Leave.eu. Evening, Richard. Thanks for joining us. You want to leave a lot of things, don't you?
Evening, Mark. Well, it's great to be back. Yeah, it's a busy time for everybody. There's a lot going on.
There is an awful lot going on. So, tell me if I've got this right. The Brexit Party is going to rebrand itself as Reform UK, position itself as an anti-lockdown party. It says the government's woeful response to the coronavirus pandemic is the single most pressing issue facing the country. It wants to give a political voice, as I've said, to opponents of the restrictions. You say ministers have lost touch with a nation divided between the terrified and the furious, and that the debate over how to respond to COVID is becoming even more toxic than the Brexit debate. So how have you managed to morph something from a party whose pretty much only policy was to leave the EU to a party that's only policy is something completely different?
Well, look, it's very simple. When we launched just 21 months ago, there was an urgent mission at hand, and that mission was to restore trust in democracy and to rescue Brexit. And we achieved that, hugely successful. And we always said after the general election that, we trusted Boris Johnson to deliver on his manifesto commitments, and that we would have a watching brief as the Brexit Party through 2020. And that's what we've done. And, credit where credit's due, the foundation of this government is its Brexit policy. And so far, so good. We're not in any way losing focus on, making sure that there isn't a last-minute huge sellout of some of the most critical aspects of Brexit that give it its huge opportunities. So we're keeping a very clear eye on that. But we did also say at the beginning of the year that there were many other areas of public life, of the way this country is run and governed, that needs reform. And it's not true, as you inferred there, Mark, to say that we didn't have any other policies last year, because we had a contract with the people in the general election where we actually set out a number of other areas where we wanted to make key changes, and we didn't call it a manifesto, we called it a contract with the people, and that set out some of the key issues that need reforming so that the government actually works for the people who pays its bills, its customers, i.e. all of us, the taxpayers, the people, because at the moment, far too often, the government seems to work for itself. And what this year has certainly shown us is that the supposed jewel in the crown, the civil service, actually, when they really need to step up to the plate, they have been found badly wanting. Many of the institutions and the quangos of government have worked at a snail-like pace. So there's much that needs reforming, and I'll come on to some of the areas. But
the urgent thing's the lockdown, right? You think there isn't a voice for people who are, I guess, kind of libertarian or pro-freedom on the lockdown issues?
Well, it's actually a bit different to that, Mark. So we've always said that some of the other areas where we think the country needs reform is in terms of the House of Lords, the BBC, in terms of the way we vote, in terms of the way the civil service functions and works for the people or not for the people. There are so many areas, and those are all things that we will be taking to the people when we fight elections next May. But the urgent crisis at hand is we need to ensure that there's a reform of the government's approach to dealing with the virus. And it's the simple fact is that lockdowns don't work. And we've seen that. We had a big lockdown, we're back here again. And it's the same in the likes of France and Germany and other countries. The World Health Organization, their key recommendation is that countries should not use lockdown as their primary objective for dealing with the virus. That is their key recommendation, and they're right on this. And the problem with lockdowns is that the cure ends up being far, far worse than the problem. And there are really good success stories that the government doesn't seem very keen to talk about. I'm referring, for example, to Sweden, that didn't have a very heavy lockdown.
Yeah.
They applied some voluntary measures. They accept they made some mistakes. We all do. The great thing is when we make mistakes, let's admit them, learn from them. You sort of have to, in a bizarre way, you slightly have to embrace your mistakes, as long as you then learn from them, adjust, and hopefully never make those mistakes again. And that's the key thing that I think Sweden recognised. They made some mistakes. They didn't protect their care homes enough. But otherwise, what's happened over the summer, they have built up clearly a strong level of immunity in the community, which means that's the reason why they're seeing very few cases and very few deaths now as we approach the winter months.
I get that, and I think you and I would largely agree about this. I had some sympathy with the approach in the early stages. I think that personally, I think lockdown's gone too far. What I'm trying to tease out, Richard, is because we at the IA deal with people from all political parties and principally people from no political party. What I'm trying to tease out, is there an underlying kind of philosophy to Reform UK, or is there a list of perhaps very cogent, just sort of complaints about the status quo, or would you be able to place your party somewhere on the ideological map? I mean, politics is so weird at the moment. We might have a Reform UK government. What could I expect to happen to taxes, spending, regulation, the National Health Service, the education system? I'm not asking you for a list of policies. So what would the approach be to making those things better?
We absolutely stand by our contract with the people that we had in the general election last year. But the thing about our ideology is that actually we need to manage things and do things and get things done much, much better, more efficiently, stop wasting taxpayers' cash, hard-earned cash. And, we're going to need to come up with a very clear, big, bold, ambitious recovery plan to dig the nation out of this. So it's not an issue of left or right. Actually, do you know what? It's about bog standard, basic competence, getting things done, focusing on the customer, the people, the taxpayer, and stop wasting these, the huge sums of taxpayers' money that is being wasted. I mean, and we see a case in point, 12 billion on a test and trace system that fundamentally doesn't work. So there's many areas where we know that this country, this great nation that we all love, can do so much better, and we need to embrace that. And we want to provide a voice for people who say, do you know what, there must be a better way. And on the particular urgent issue in hand, the issue of the virus, there is a better way. There is another way. It's called the Great Barrington Way.
Yeah,
and so
interesting.
We've got
the Great Barrington Declaration.
The Great Barrington Declaration, that has been put forward by some of the greatest experts in the world, epidemiologists, the likes of Shanetta Gupta from Oxford, the likes of Martin Kildorff, Jay Bhattacharya, these experts from Harvard and from Stanford and tens of thousands of other scientists. They've put forward a really credible alternative with totally focused protection of those who need it, the vulnerable, those who want shielding, and do that job properly rather than a scattergun approach. And then the rest of us with sensible hygiene measures can actually get on with our lives. And what's bizarre, Mark, is that the government and the mainstream media, they don't want to talk about this alternative proposition. They want to sort of diss it as fringe and not experts. And you wonder that if they're not prepared to talk about it, that means one thing: they're frightened of it. What are they frightened of? What are they trying to hide? Why won't they let us talk about it?
Okay, but what do you think? What I'm interested in, and especially your choice of reform as your name, is oftentimes politicians. It's a question of rearranging who's sitting in the deck chairs in the Titanic, right? That I don't think the Conservative Party or the Labour Party have done much in government to bring about fundamental reform at the Whitehall level. So it's not just that you do different policies; you do it in a different way. How would the civil service change under a Tice Farage government, for example? What would be different about it? Or is it just Tice and Farage would take different decisions to Hancock and Johnson?
No, I think take a practical example. What we've seen, for example, with Public Health England, was a complete inability to move at pace and embrace expertise, from around from the universities, from some of the pharma companies, from some of the private sector, to ensure that you got a testing system up and running early doors, which was highly recommended. It was just a failure of management, a failure of competence. There's always better ways to do stuff. And actually, the model I really like is where secretaries of state, they can bring in, and it's welcomed, they bring in people from the private sector who come in and help run a department, not dissimilar to the way that the executive works in the US. And the great thing about that is that if someone comes in for 3 or 4 years, and it needs to become embedded as part of our culture, successful people who've achieved, who've done well in whatever walk of life, whether it's business in the private sector, whether it's being hugely successful in the arts or the military. We want to be able to, as part of our culture, that you would come into public life and essentially do your duty. And that's how it's considered in the States. It's part of your civic duty to go and give 3 or 4 years to help make things run better. And I think that's a real cultural opportunity that sadly at the moment is actually is not welcomed at all. It's really hard to get crossover between the private sector and the civil service. And I believe that there's a sort of a win-win. Let's try and extract the best of both.
You're at one with Dominic Cummings on this, aren't you? His whole mission in life is that the civil service are useless, and he's got to appoint better people, and let's bring in people with private sector expertise. And Sir Humphrey Appleby doesn't know what he's doing. You're gonna have an alliance with Dom to get this to actually happen at last.
It would be great to get this happen. Dominic's quite right on this, but it's hard. But we need to, we need the people to have the opportunity to want to vote on it, to embrace it, to urge it to happen. And that has to start somewhere. So yeah, look, on this, Dom is absolutely right, and that's one of our key beliefs. When you think, Mark, for example, the government spends over £900 billion a year on all its various services and everything. We know there are tens of billions of pounds that are wasted through inefficiency, through weak procurement, through mistakes. Through incompetence. That's real money, real cash.
But what folk like us at the IEA would say, Richard, that yes, that's absolutely true. Our analysis is that there's a fundamental problem in state central planning. And if you have bureaucrats in Whitehall or politicians designing systems, they tend not to be as efficient as systems that are run in the entrepreneurial free side of the economy, the market. And the government should do less but better, if you like. You might well argue that there should be welfare support for the poor, but you're probably better to do that through, for example, cash transfers, rather than having a minister for food who delivers food parcels to people's front doors. That it's actually the private sector. The private sectors mistakes are made, otherwise businesses wouldn't go bust. But it's a much better process of getting an optimal allocation of resources. So broadly speaking, I'm simplifying enormously 60 plus years of academic scholarly history at the IEA, but our prescriptions are to move things out of the state sector and towards the private sector.
And look, I understand that, Mark, the flaw in your model, the free market model, exactly like that, we've got it at the moment. It's called Serco. It has utterly, woefully failed on test and trace because it's been basically left to get on with it without competent, proper supervision from people from the private sector who basically, they've become gamekeeper. They've turned gamekeeper from poacher, and is that competence. I believe there's a win-win between the two models. Yes, you're right. Governments are not good at managing things. But if you just dole out huge contracts with no supervision, no penalties, no tendering to the private sector, we, the people, the taxpayer.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you on that. That the problem when you get a kind of a private-public partnership is the public side of it keeps changing its mind. The reason that governments can't get databases set up at any efficient level in the same way as the private sector is they'll give some colossal contract to somebody, probably putting 2 noughts on the end of it they don't need to put on, and then they keep changing the spec. And well, if you're an IT consultant, you keep charging them the bill for your hourly time, right?
It's very simple, Mark. It comes because that's being organised by civil servants who've never procured anything properly in their lives. They've never had any experience at the sharp end. Focusing on the cash flow, the P&L, losing sleep at night because the business might go bust. Those are the sort of entrepreneurs and people that I want to come into public life and to, essentially to give up 3 or 4 years having achieved in helping departments, helping those civil servants drive value, drive for performance, so that actually these public services that everybody wants delivered competently, properly, efficiently, and at real value, that can be done. And we've never properly tried it here in the UK, and I think it's a great opportunity. It's about reforming the way we do things. Look, okay. I believe in continuous improvement. There's always a better way to do things. The urgent thing to improve is the way we deal with the virus. And on this virus, what really troubles me is that Boris today said there's only one way. There isn't. There's clearly another way. There's always another way. We've got a situation now where the National Health Service has essentially become the National COVID Service. And, tens of thousands of cancer, cardiac, lung patients are essentially, they're not having their illnesses diagnosed, scanned, treated. Thousands more life years will be lost from non-COVID patients than the life years they're trying to save who may have COVID.
Richard, I want to stop you there, not because I disagree with you or I don't want to discuss this, but you're in danger of stealing all of the numbers from the next section of my script, right? and I want to move on to the cost of COVID. Stay with us, Richard. I want to bring in another couple of guests to see if we can pilot another way through this. What is the cost of COVID? There's just been a vote in the House of Commons today by 516 votes to 38. You were right, Richard, earlier. You said it was 38, of whom 32 were Conservatives, voted against government. England is therefore just hours away from going into a second lockdown. Whole raft of new restrictions coming in. I think we've got a slide that we can show our YouTube viewers about that. You probably know them all by now, pub closures and all of the rest. These restrictions will be in place until December the 2nd. God only knows what happens after that. So I want to bring in two new guests to discuss with Richard what we think the cost is economically and in terms of health impacts. Jonathan Kitson is an independent forecaster and researcher, recently written on problems of procurement in the British Army, the integrated review of defence and foreign policy, and why former supermodel Caprice should be on SAGE, the pandemic committee. Definitely want to hear more about that. Also delighted to be joined by Brendan O'Neill, columnist, editor of the online magazine Spiked, also written for The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Australian, The Big Issue, many others, often on our TV screens. And we've just shown our viewers on YouTube a couple of slides, and they were picking out some of the health problems that Richard was outlining, that if you make the NHS, the National COVID Service, there's actually an awful lot of other afflictions that seem to go untreated. Good evening to you, Jonathan. Good evening to you, Brendan. Lovely to see each of you. Brendan, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that we're going into the second lockdown in just a few hours' time as we're presently speaking? And do you think there's any mathematical or logical sense in the government from both an economic perspective and indeed a health perspective? You could put either on the table, or do you think that we've just got into this kind of hamster wheel of doom of just kind of running round and round and round in circles? Brendan, great to see you. Good evening.
Hi, Mark. I think it's a catastrophe, a genuine catastrophe, what they're doing. I think it is incredibly destructive. I really agree with the point Richard made, how destructive that phrase is. There is no alternative. We've heard Boris say that. We've heard Michael Gove say that. There is no alternative is my least favourite phrase in the political world. I know it was a favourite of Margaret Thatcher, and I wouldn't want to insult any IEA fans of Thatcher, but it is such a deadening phrase because it is essentially the end of politics. Because when you say there is no alternative, what you are saying is there's no point having a debate. There's no point looking at the facts in a different way, and there's no point coming up with new policies because this is the only path we can take. So it's a very undemocratic outlook. It's a very authoritarian outlook. And what Boris and others are essentially saying is don't talk about this, don't discuss this. This is the only option. And anyone who says anything else is a lunatic or a fruitcake. Mm-hmm. So I think they are steering us down a very conformist authoritarian path, which will have incredibly destructive impacts on people's jobs, on the economy, on health, on mental health, on spiritual health. I think they underestimate just how deeply damaging this will be to the nation.
Jonathan, what's your take on this? Why are we going down this path? Are there alternatives? If there are alternatives, why are they apparently being ruled out of order rather than seriously considered? Jonathan, let me bring you in and let's make sure you're unmuted as well.
Hi, Mark. Yes, I agree. I think lockdown is obviously a governmental failure. And I'd like to sort of address one of the points that's been made in terms of this Great Barrington Declaration, this idea that one can isolate vulnerable people. I myself am a vulnerable person. I have cystic fibrosis, and I've been isolating effectively since February. So I'm very, very aware of what the cost of isolation are. Isolation is different from lockdown. So if you take 16 million people and you say to them, you can't go outside, you can't meet your friends, family, you are going a step beyond lockdown. So it's not just your lockdown, you're not just putting the measures in place which have been put in tonight, you're going a little bit more severe. And they're not necessarily very nice measures. But also I do have CF, and one of the things that's gone slightly under the radar this year is a new drug called Kaftrio, which has improved my lung function quite substantially. And the reason I want to mention that is because it does make me quite optimistic about the prospects of a vaccine. That is, of course, another alternative. We get a vaccine and we're able to inoculate the vast majority of the population and therefore move on in that way. And I'm very optimistic about that. I think that's probably going to happen within the next about 100 days. We had some very, very good news a couple of days ago about GPs signing contracts in order to start inoculating elderly and vulnerable people in the middle towards the middle of December. And I think realistically, we're going to start to do mass vaccination around about January. So
wow,
you're
the first optimist we've had on this programme for bloody ages, Jonathan.
Well, I mean, I try to be.
I'm hoping
it's hard to be optimistic having been locked down all
year. Annabel, quick thought from you before I come back to Richard. You're in charge of directing our communications here at the IEA. What have we communicated about the best analysis we can give on the cost of COVID, either economically or in terms of, if you like, the unintended consequences with regard to health? And I'll ask the tech guys to put the back on the screen some of the potential health consequences, things that we're witnessing, like suicide rates going up enormously. London's suicide attempts have doubled. London's averaging, it was about 37 a day suicides or suicide attempts in London. London's averaging about 8 COVID deaths a day at the moment, considering the average age of suicides is 37. This means more than 130,000 life years have been lost in this year, thanks in large part to lockdown, if indeed you do credit that to lockdown. Cancer Research UK say 350,000 missed appointments on urgent referrals to hospital, 27 million fewer GP appointments between March and October. I think that's compared to last year. Compared to the 5-year average, the number of people dying at home from Alzheimer's and dementia is up about 80%, heart disease up by more than a quarter, Parkinson's up by 70%. Sorry, Annabel, I just read all of that out. I asked you to audit the cost. What do you think the cost is? I've given some health numbers there, but not some economic ones. Annabel.
Sure. So, I mean, Christopher Snowdon, the IEA's head of lifestyle economics, called it economic suicide to plunge the UK or England back into a second national lockdown. I'll tell you a little bit about what our experts have been saying this week, Mark. Len Shackleton, our employment expert, has cast doubt over how many small businesses are going to survive between now and Christmas. There are a lot that would be hoping that the run up to Christmas would keep them ticking over. In fact, there are a lot that depend on this at the best of times, and they will simply throw in the towel. He said that he thinks job losses are likely to be concentrated in those smaller businesses. How many? Rather like COVID itself, there's no obvious counterfactual to compare with. We don't know how much consumer behavior would have changed in the absence of a lockdown anyway, because people are so terrified of coronavirus. But he said he wouldn't be surprised if we lost another 500,000 jobs in the run up to Christmas, and that unemployment would rise by 300,000 or so. Julian Jessup has been a little bit more positive. He's always glass half full when it comes to the economic consequences of lockdown. He's the IEA's economics fellow. He said that this won't go on as long as the last lockdown. And at the moment, the government is resisting pressure to close schools, which we know could cost each school child around £14,000 over the course of their lifetime. That's according to data out today, I believe, from the NIESR. He has, as I say, Julian's been a bit more upbeat, but he's nonetheless struggled to find sources of optimism after this new lockdown. He says that with schools open, businesses better prepared, and a clearer exit strategy, the economic hit should be less severe than in the spring. But even if it were only a fifth as bad, this would still mean a hit to GDP of at least 5%.
Yeah, it's pretty grim stuff. And Richard, I know you've got to leave us soon, so let me come back to you. And oftentimes, I think we look on this trade-off debate a bit too binary. We talk about saving lives on the one hand or the economy on the other, but the two are clearly interlinked, right? You came up with a great quote earlier this week that a sick economy leads to sick people, unfortunately, and a dead economy leads to dead people, unfortunately. So it's not as if we can wipe out one without the other. What do you make of how grim this is going to be in both health and wealth terms?
But it's fundamental. Let's be optimistic. A healthy economy leads to healthier people leading longer lives. But the reverse is true. And this government seems to have completely forgotten that. And, you know, it's the least well off, the poorest in society, who will suffer the most and have their lives shortened by the greatest duration. And I just think that inequality gap is the most sickening. It's the most heartbreaking. And that's what I think, you know, there's just no a voice for them in this debate, and we in the Reform UK Party, we hope to provide that voice. People have the chance at the elections next year to do that. It is so important, and yet at the moment the government does seem to be wanting to shut down debate. Whereas actually, I mean, Jonathan referred earlier to, there is obviously, for those who do need shielding and protecting, it is difficult. But one thing is for sure, for those who need that and want that, let's do that properly. Let's do that really well, rather than, I think what we've suffered so much at the moment is actually not doing it properly. And I just like to do things really well. Of course, there are many elderly folk who actually, they don't want to shield. They want to see their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and if they're in their 80s or 90s, in the nicest possible way, in the time they've got left, they want to hug their grandkids as much. Some of them want to hug them as much as possible. So I think, this is all the mental health. And you touched earlier on suicides, whether it's undergrads, when you've got 88-year-old ladies committing suicide because they can't hug their grandchildren, what sort of people are our leaders? What do they think they're doing?
Richard, before I let you go there, where do you think, I mean, again, we're a think tank, not a polling agency, but where do you think public opinion is? I was trying to look through some opinion polls and I could make neither head nor tail of them, although given what tends to happen when actual real events occur and opinion polls fail to predict, and maybe I should stop looking at opinion polls. But I can't work out whether people oppose this lockdown, support it. I mean, it seems actually, unsurprisingly, when you ask people that, they want their cake and eat it. When you ask people about tax and spending, they want taxes down, spending up, and the deficit down. Well, you can't square that circle. I think lots of contradictory stuff. Where do you think the public are in this?
I think the issue is, I think people are a little bit afraid. They think it's a bit politically incorrect to actually dare to say that they're not in favour of lockdown, that actually they believe we should get on with it. It's a bit like when you answer a pollster, are you going to vote for Brexit or are you going to vote for Trump? People sort of don't want to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. When you talk to real people, taxi drivers, construction workers, shop workers, people running the dry cleaners around the corner, let me tell you, they are all furious. They're having their lives, their financial lives ripped away from them. They are not pro-lockdown at all. I think these pollsters from YouGov, they need to get out of it and talk to real people, not just civil servants stuck in their homes.
Brendan, a common theme of your work and commentary is that ordinary folk, the working classes, you might call them, are increasingly divorced from and detached from the political elite, not represented by them, often patronised by them. Do you think that's true of lockdown, or is Joe Public a bit more betwixt and between on it? And Richard, I should say, sorry, I know you needed to go by 25 to, so just before I let Brendan come in, thank you very much for joining us. I do need to ask you for your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer number between 0 and 10, must be an integer, about how optimistic you are about the UK over a 2 to 3 year time horizon.
If people vote for Reform UK in the forthcoming elections, then I'm going to say between 6 and 7. But if they don't, I'm between 3 and 4.
So that was 4 integers. I'm going to average that out as a 5 for you. Okay, I'll average. Richard, great to see you. Thanks so much. Speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Great to have you on. Brendan, sorry, I was conscious I needed to let Richard leave. What do you think? Do you think there is a real detachment between the people who are running this and the wants and desires and perhaps the revealed preferences of ordinary people rather than what they say to YouGov or Gallup or whoever?
Yes, I think so. I think lockdown clearly has a highly disproportionate impact on less well-off people. We know, for example, that less well-off kids, their education suffers far more greatly than privately educated kids do when there's a lockdown. We know that poorer people are more likely to lose their jobs, more likely to see a really devastating fall in their income. Whereas there is another strata of society, many of them, public sector workers, academics, experts, the political class, and even some journalists who can afford a lockdown, or, lockdown is even an interesting experiment for these people. They get to stay at home in their, relatively nice flats or houses, possibly with a garden, and it's quite pleasurable. So I think there's a very important class divide in this. I was so struck by, just to prematurely bring in America for 1 second, I was really struck by the Bloomberg analysis of who gave donations to Trump and who gave donations to Biden. And if you look at Biden, most of the employees who gave him donations come from big banks, big tech, universities, whereas the kind of employees who gave donations to the Trump campaign were truck drivers, construction workers, farmers, cops. And it really struck me that in the US, you had a situation during the COVID period where these relatively well-off people were all at home tweeting about how terrible Trump is and how awful the world has become. And the people who were still farming their food, delivering their Amazon products, basically still working, these are the kind of people who ended up voting for Trump. I think there's a similar phenomenon in the UK where we have almost a feudalistic system now, where we have people who can afford to stay at home and they find it quite exciting, and other people who are desperately worried about their futures because the lockdown is going to have a devastating impact on their livelihoods.
Do you think Brendan, that we haven't yet hit the eye of the storm? I mean, I don't know. You know, I'm a middle class, rather limp-wristed sort of guy, and like sitting in my garden. I don't claim to be working class at all, and I'm also one of the people who can best, it doesn't matter if my income goes down a bit. It's not the difference between me eating and not. But I'm always surprised that there isn't as much fury and kickback in the United Kingdom as I expect. I mean, I was expecting to see many more people just breaching the rules and saying to hell with it, or more demonstrations or whatever. There doesn't seem to have been a manifestation of public anger, or at least one that I can't detect. But maybe that's because I'm spending too long in my middle class garden rather than with ordinary people. Or do you think there is anger and frustration beginning to manifest now, Brendan?
I think there's definitely frustration, and I think there wasn't first time around. I think the government successfully terrorized the population during the first lockdown, and in fact, it so successfully terrorized us that it had a great amount of difficulty trying to encourage us to go back out again, which is why they had to do Eat Out to help out and all that kind of stuff. But I think this time around, in the second lockdown, I sense much more frustration. Whether it will tip over into anger, I don't know. But even though I think lockdown has a disproportionate impact on working class and poorer people, just as Richard says, this isn't a left-right issue. I also don't think it is, strictly speaking, a class issue. There are numerous middle-class people. There are some very posh people, and there are some ordinary people who are all frustrated with what's going on, who are all absolutely at their wits' end in terms of not being able to see people, not being able to live their lives. I do think there is the space for a broad coalition that just asks reasonable questions of the government and demands answers to questions about the lockdown. So that's the kind of thing I think we need going ahead.
Jonathan, let me bring you back in before I introduce some more guests to the show. You were highlighting that we need a sort of different strokes for different folks approach, and with your vulnerabilities, a different process might have to be applied to you in some ways, to those who don't have similar vulnerabilities. What's your view there of public sentiment about this? Does it turn out actually the British are just a terribly polite, compliant people and might tut and raise an eyebrow? Or is there, do you think, greater annoyance beginning to build about the restrictions that are being put on our lives and the corollaries that brings with it, whether that's the healthcare we can access, or our ability to see our family and friends, or our ability to conduct our business normally? Where do you put the level of irritation and frustration and its trajectory?
I think frustration is probably high, but I think it's frustration perhaps at the virus. I don't think the government is doing lockdown because it fancies it. I don't think it's doing it because it wants to terrify the population. I think it's doing it in response to a deadly pandemic. It is not doing it for the sake of it. And in terms of public anger, as far as I've seen, in terms of polling, people may well dispute if the polling is good or not. The majority of British people do seem to support the lockdown. And I also think in terms of, maybe people aren't out on the streets protesting, people aren't, visibly angry. That's because there is a deadly virus circulating around and people do not want to catch it. It seems to me that anger, yes, people are angry. Yes, people are frustrated. I mean, I almost certainly am. I haven't been able to see my friends. I haven't been able to go out. whose fault is that? Well, fundamentally, is it the government in March? It's a virus. It's not these things happen. There are very, very, very big problems with the response and some of the things that we failed to do over the summer. We failed to have a proper plan, a proper information campaign about how you can actually catch this. We're still encouraging people mainly to wash their hands, when what we should have really been doing is saying that this is an airborne, it's a respiratory droplet virus, and the government really should have been pushing that rather than continuing to wash hands. But back to this again. I think back to the vaccine again. I just would like to really make this clear. The government's current vaccine plan, even if I'm right, and even if we start to approve vaccines, there are currently 3 vaccines in phase 3 trials at the moment, which means they're quite close to being approved. There are 11 vaccines in the developed world. There are 6 vaccines which have been approved worldwide. I'm not sure about you. You might not want to take a Russian vaccine. Some people would. But the government's current vaccine plan is only to vaccinate over 50s and vulnerable people. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think we should be trying to vaccinate the whole population. And I also think that actually we could have a bit more of a free market approach to vaccines. And currently you cannot get a trial vaccine. I think if you want to take the choice to have a trial vaccine,
and that should be your choice. Yep.
If you wanted to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, you should be able to do that.
Okay. Stay with us, lady and gentlemen. Let me bring in 2 more guests just to get their thoughts on this before we turn our sights on the other side of the pond. It's great to be joined by, back on the show, Dominic Frisby, a man of many, many parts, financial writer, comedian, actor, the voice behind many TV ads, author of the great book, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future, just out in paperback. So if you were too tight-fisted to buy the hardback edition, you now have a cheaper option available to you. And a real pleasure to welcome to the show for the first time, John Longworth, also a man of many parts, chairman of Independent Business Network, former MEP for Yorkshire and Humber, co-founded Leave Means Leave, former Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, and most importantly of all, a member of the Institute of Economic Affairs Advisory Council. I think we're going to have to do some work on making sure that John is rendered vertical rather than horizontal. So let me start with Dominic. Dominic, just a quick take on. Good evening, John. Good evening, Dominic. Dominic, quick take on where we've got to. You're a libertarian kind of chap. Are you sighing, angry, phlegmatic? How should some sort of pro-freedom fight back manifest itself in response to what's happening at the moment? Or do you think any elements of it are indeed reasonable?
Well, it's such a difficult question, but I tend to think there are all sorts of terrible unintended consequences to this, and there is a sort of class of people who it quite suits to sit at home, stay at home, and live their lives and have things delivered to them by another class of people who only seem to be able to find work as delivery drivers and so on. There are all sorts of weird unintended consequences. I look at stand-up comedy, which is one of the ways I used to earn my bread and butter. And that was a thriving, buoyant industry until February, March of this year. And then suddenly it was just turned on its head. And even when it was impossible for any comic to earn a living as a comedian anymore. And then when the lockdown ended in the summer, comedy just never, half the comedy clubs had gone bust. Those that did reopen were like operating at about a third capacity, with everyone sitting further apart. Now, laughter is very much a herd thing. So when everyone's all together, you laugh more. So suddenly the atmosphere in the comedy clubs just wasn't the same. And then here we go, things just finally starting to get going again. And then in we go with another lockdown just before Christmas, when all the comics have their Christmas gigs, which pay double because you're dealing with drunk corporates and all the rest of it. And it's just decimated an industry through no fault of its own. And I look at some of these statistics and you read, that 30% of us already have natural immunity, when you read from alternative virologists, not the government ones, and that actually 30% of us are now resistant to it because the virus has passed through. So only really 40% of the population is vulnerable, and there isn't such a thing as a second wave, and it's a manifestation. And you read all this alternate stuff and you just kind of go, oh my goodness me, surely the aggregation of 65 million individual decisions would work better than some kind of centrally imposed thing. Just let me finish one last thing. Sweden let people basically do what they like and see how they see fit. And a lot of people locked down quite naturally. Whereas Argentina had one of the longest, most imposed lockdowns everywhere. And half the population just ignored it and carried on with their lives as best they could anyway. And Argentina suffered worse than Sweden. That's because in Argentina, the law's just a sort of guideline, whereas in other cultures, it's more literal.
It's abided by. John, if we got you the right way up, what's your take on this? What's your take on this, John?
Well, the government's not the right way up. My iPhone's propped up by a book on Mao here, and I think the government not just imported a Chinese flu, they've also imported a Chinese polity, because we have a government now that's actually infringing my civil liberties. It's causing me to not to be able to do things that I would normally be able to do by decree. And I think that's absolutely appalling from a civil liberties point of view, let alone anything else. Now, whatever the rights and wrongs of the medical evidence are for this COVID virus, the price we're now going to pay in the future for this second lockdown is simply disproportionate. The family-owned and family-run businesses, which I interact with in the Independent Business Network, 83% of businesses in the UK, by the way, are family-owned or family-run. They are suffering majorly. Big multinationals have very deep pockets. They can afford to ride these things out. They actually probably might benefit from competition being wiped out, and therefore holding court in the commercial world. But for family-owned and family-run businesses, this is a catastrophe. And it's going to be a catastrophe also for that generation who aren't really infected. I mean, if you think about under 50s, the under 50s simply are highly unlikely to die of this disease. But they are being majorly affected in terms of their employment prospects.
And so what would your solution be, John? Just, let people make their own minds up.
Yeah, well, I think, as Dominic said, the Swedish approach has a lot of appeal. Obviously, there are things that the Swedes did that, go beyond what is commonly said. They didn't just let things rip, but they relied on the fact that the population in Sweden would do the right things. And it's a less densely populated country. But then again, some of the cities are not less densely populated. And they've come out quite well, really, because while they had a higher death rate during the March, April, May period, that is in fact now reversed out. And as far as I can see, the average death rate during COVID, as a consequence of COVID, the average age of death has been 82, which is about 1 year before the normal average age of death of 83. So you can't have a situation where we say this disease is having catastrophic effects on the death rate, which is what the Prime Minister has been saying. If we're not careful with a combination of COVID and the Brexit negotiations, this government's going to be less a government, an oven-ready government, and more of a turkey.
Right. You've been working on that line, John. I can tell. You've been working on that one. Jonathan and Annabel, before I let you go, very quickly, what do you think the way out of this is? Jonathan, you've been quite optimistic about the vaccine coming on stream quickly. Is that the route out? And then, and also, Jonathan, what's your optimism rating?
I think that if we get a vaccine, that's going to be very good. But obviously, there are huge challenges, and we've mentioned comedy, we've mentioned small businesses. I think one of the best things that the government could do, and also as a reward for young people who John rightly said have suffered sort of in terms of their social lives this year, would be to do some sort of meaningful planning reform. So to make sure my peers could actually get a hold of the house, that would be nice, and that would, go to some way towards monetarily compensating my generation. In the short term, in terms of vaccine, I'm very optimistic. I think within 100 days, we'll have a vaccine and it'll be rolled out. If I'm wrong, you can call me back and you can drag on me for my bad prediction. In terms of the UK government over the next 2-3 years, I'm broadly optimistic.
Not the UK government, the UK.
The UK, I think we're going to be about a 7 or an 8. I think.
Pick one.
I'm going to go for an 8. I'm going to be optimistic.
8, brilliant. Okay, that's helpful. Jonathan, lovely to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us. Annabel, your thoughts before I let you go, and your optimism number. How do you see us getting out of this?
I'm not especially optimistic, to be honest, particularly when it comes to getting a vaccine. I simply don't think that we can base policy on that. I think what the government has really failed to get a hand on is TTI, test, track and isolate. And the isolating has been the real issue. And we talked earlier about whether people were going to protest in the streets. I think, Mark, we're going to see a much quieter rebellion. I think we're going to see a rebellion behind closed doors. And this is partly because the government has given us a masterclass in how not to do political communication. We haven't had leadership. We haven't had cost benefit analyses as to why a 10 p.m. curfew or a rule of 6 have been introduced. And as a result, we're not going to get compliance. We're not going to get adherence to these rules. And I don't think that it's inconceivable that as a result, we're going to find ourselves in this vicious cycle of low adherence to lockdown, which isn't going to stem the transmission. We're going to have higher hospitalizations, higher deaths, and that's going to lead to longer lockdowns. People are going to be irked. They were told 4 weeks, but actually it's 6 because they want a final push until Christmas. And we're just going to be in this cycle. We're going to be dipping in and out of lockdown until either we get a handle on TTI, either we get a vaccine, though I'm not especially optimistic about that. And I do think it would be foolish to base policy on it.
So you're going to be less optimistic than Jonathan, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if we look at the history of pandemics, we know that they tend to last 18 to 24 months. The hope is that it will mutate into a less virulent strain, and that by May we will be reaching something like herd immunity one way or another, or certainly by the end of next summer. So with that in mind, I'll give it a 5, Mark.
5, middle of the road. Annabel, Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us. John, Dominic, Brendan, please stay with us. I'm going to bring in 2 more guests. It's a circus. We've got hundreds and hundreds of guests. 2 more guests are going to join us. I've got Patrick Basham, pollster, who's been with us a good number of times on the show, trying to decipher what's happening in America. I'm not sure it's any easier after polls have closed to as it was last week. But Patrick is back with us, the director of the Democracy Institute, and my friend John Tillman, the CEO of the Chicago-based Illinois Policy Institute. So I want to move our discussion onto what's happening on the other side of the pond. If I'm feeling sounding a bit irritable and looking a bit tired, that's because I stayed up to about 4 o'clock in the morning, at which point it was completely evident Donald Trump had won. And I woke up again about 10 o'clock in the morning, at which point it was completely evident that Joe Biden had won. I haven't been keeping a view on my phone for the last couple of days, but I want to move on to the topic of America. Brendan, let me come back to you before I let you go. What do you make of what's happened over there? I mean, we still don't know the result. I guess it looks like Joe Biden's probably just about got enough electoral college votes to win, but I'm not a constitutional expert. I don't know what the legal process will be. But democracy almost seems to have broken down in the States, doesn't it? We've completely lost losers' consent, from what I can see. I mean, Donald Trump himself doesn't seem to be the sort of chap who would lose graciously, but almost whatever the outcome, it seems to be especially grim. Would you not agree, Brendan?
It's looking complicated. I think there's a great irony to all these liberals who are raging against Donald Trump for refusing to accept the election result, considering they've spent the past 4 years spreading Russia conspiracy theories, trying impeachment measures, and using general hysteria to try and overthrow the result of 2016. So there's a large amount of hypocrisy to that. I think the results in America are extraordinary, to be honest. As you say, we don't really know the winner yet. I expect it will be Biden in the White House. But the wrongness of the pollsters, the wrongness of the pundits and the experts, I think is incredibly revealing. And what it suggests is there is a vast chasm between the kind of political class, the observing classes, and ordinary people. And one of the most interesting phenomenon, I think, has been the shy Trump voter. And we now have such an extraordinary amount of political intolerance where anyone who likes Trump is denounced as essentially a fascist, that many people keep their political views to themselves and aren't even honest with pollsters. So the disconnect between the political elites and ordinary voters is extraordinary. I also think the huge turnout among Latinos and even a shift in the votes of black males for Trump, this is really interesting. And I think that's a bit of a body blow to identity politics, a good body blow to identity politics. We need to move away from the kind of racial blocks that were pushed by the left towards the kind of politics that someone like Trump is promoting, which is, you know, you can support me regardless of your background. So there are some positive things, there are some interesting things, but at the moment it's a bit of a mess.
So before I let you go, Brendan, what's your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer looking like, an integer between 0 and 10?
In the UK, it's probably around 5 or 6 at the moment, because I think the government has gone completely mad. But I still trust in the good sense of ordinary people. And I think at some point there will be pushback and something will break down. So at the moment, I would say 5.
5. Okay, we're getting lots of 5s. We're getting lots of 5s. John Tillman's with us. Patrick Basham's with us. Good. So these guys on the other side of the pond can explain what the heck is going on over there. John, good evening where we're at. Good afternoon to you in Chicago. Patrick, good afternoon to you in Washington, D.C. Patrick, perhaps I can start with you. Seems even if on the binary outcome of who the next president will be Joe Biden, a lot of your polling seemed to have got it considerably closer to right than a good number of the polls that thought he was going to walk it. What do you make of the situation, Patrick, we're in at the moment? I was trying to do my calculations just before this show, and I think my best guess was that Joe Biden will get to 270 electoral college delegates, which is one more than he needs to win.
Well, I think big picture wise, there's an irony going forward. I mean, we all knew that should Donald Trump be reelected, it would be 2016 all over again. That is, as Brendan was touching on, you'd have another 4 years like the previous 4 years where roughly half the country considered the president to be wholly or somewhat illegitimate. What wasn't anticipated was that if Joe Biden won, and if he does win, he will be seen now as partially or wholly illegitimate by half of the country, because it is going to be very difficult to convince those who voted for Donald Trump that what happened overnight and what may happen over the next few days in certain important key battleground states here in America was all on the up and up. So either man, one candidate went in tainted, and the other one is going to come out tainted too. So any process, I mean, Joe Biden, his campaign, such as it was a lot about unity and consensus and being a healer, not a divider, and all that. The country is so much more divided than it was even 24 hours ago. And the prospects for any kind of consensus or healing or unity are, I think, nil, regardless of who's eventually declared the winner.
Just before I come to John, very quickly, Patrick, but why does Joe Biden come out tainted? I mean, is there any suggestion? I've been trying to follow a whole range of broadcasters today that there has been any systemic fraud, ballot stuffing. I don't quite know what the nature of the allegations are, but I mean, he may have only just won, but if he's only just won, he's won, hasn't he? I mean, why is he tainted?
Oh, we don't have the time to go through it all, but I mean, let's just say it's the argument being put forward in the short term is that it is a remarkable coincidence that in the middle of the night, at 2 a.m. Eastern time, with 6 important states in play, with Donald Trump with large, arguably insurmountable leads in each of them, they all coincidentally, in an uncoordinated manner, stopped counting the votes and started again a few hours later at the same time. And most of them anyway, produced huge amounts of votes for Joe Biden. So, for example, in Wisconsin, a pile of votes were discovered, just under 140,000, of which I believe at most a handful literally were for Donald Trump, right. The rest for Joe Biden. So in a statistical sense, in a political sense, in the way life goes sense, There are so many anomalies, putting it very diplomatically, that the Trump people are fairly confident that they'll have a lot to work with, assuming that they need that, because just as Joe Biden is confident that he's going to rack up enough electoral votes this week, the Trump people are also confident that the outstanding states that haven't been called yet, enough of them are going to fall to him. But if they don't, then we are in for a huge legal battle.
Yeah. John, great to have you back. What's your take on it from Illinois? I was saying earlier, think tanks aren't necessarily directly interested in the electoral process, but it affects public policy. And my concern is that we've lost any semblance of losers' consent here. And if you don't have losers' consent, democracy ceases to function. We had an element of that, I think, with regard to our Brexit referendum. And it might happen here in America, almost whoever finally prevails through the electoral college, the courts, or anything else. Do you not think, John? And welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, Mark. And yes, we do have a problem with losers' consent, and it started in 2000 or 2016, depending on where you want to take your marker on the presidential. Certainly, the resistance that was launched when Trump won in 2016 would be the first example since 2000 of the loser not consenting. I think it's interesting that Hillary Clinton, prior to this, advised Joe Biden that whatever the outcome if Donald Trump wins, never, ever, ever concede. So losers' consent, lack of it, was going to happen regardless of who won. I thought Patrick was spot on a variety of things, and I'll add a little flavor to it because I'm involved in other things besides the think tank, of course, and I've been very involved in voter fraud. And so we assembled
investigating it, not practicing it. I'm hoping.
No, I do both. You must first investigate it to understand how to do it. But anyway, we put together a database of I think it's 14 states, including all the states in question, and we matched the voter files with real estate records, and we looked for anomalies. And what Patrick's referring to actually has happened in both Milwaukee and Detroit, where you had precincts where you had 90-some% turnout, and in a given precinct, maybe 1,000 votes for Biden and 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 votes for Trump. But in the areas around those precincts that are also primarily African American, you had a more normal voter turnout of anywhere from 58 to 62%. So one wonders, why do these concentrated precincts in these very specific locations in parts of both Detroit and Milwaukee have these anomalies? And I think that is one of the veins that they are going to mine. And I would agree. I'd also just say from some of the things I've heard through some connections there that they believe they're still going to Arizona. We'll see. But and they still think they have a shot in Nevada. And again, we'll see. But I think if everything was reversed, believe me, the Democrats and Joe Biden would be pursuing every avenue as the Trump team is.
I love the idea that this could all come down to the spin of the wheel in Las Vegas, Nevada, when they start counting again on Thursday, right? Dominic, let me bring you back in. What do you make of things on the other side of the pond? I joke with John and Patrick and others in America that we seem to have been in a bit of a race for whose public policy and politics has been wackier over the course of the last few years. I guess the Americans are edging ahead given over the last 24 hours. But are you concerned like I am that the processes seem to be breaking down, that you could almost, it felt in my water that this election was going to end up like this. We seem to have moved away from, you have an argument, people put forward their arguments, you have a vote and that prevails. Seems to be democracy's fraying, really, well, I was going to say at the edges, but a bit more deeply than that. Don't you think, Dominic?
Yeah, it's really concerning, Mark. And, whatever the outcome, there's going to be some disgruntled people. And it should be as simple as you suggested. But there's so many complexities and they get manipulated. But I was just, the problem is if they uncover voter fraud, 3 or 6 months down the line, the new president's already in place. They can't then turn around and get rid of him, can they? So once you've got away with it, you're good. But I would say this. I was just thinking about so many of the problems that have gone on with this election and COVID and everything else that's going on in the world. So on the one hand, we have this electoral fraud. On the other hand, we have the damage of COVID and all the policies that are coming out of COVID to deal with it, whether it's going to be higher taxes or taxation by the back door and MMT and inflation and debasing the currency, all the censorship that's going on in social media now. They're trying to stop the platforms that that enabled Brexit and Trump to happen in 2016. They're trying to clamp down on them all social. And the solution to all of them lies in this technology behind that thing you can see on my back there, the thing I wrote a book about in 2014, Bitcoin. You know, the distributed ledger technology is a form of money that you can't close it down. You can't debase it in the way that you debase fiat currency. One of the applications of blockchain technology is in voting systems, which are, you know, we would vote and then the vote would come out at 10 o'clock or whenever the things shut. We would know the result. There wouldn't be a 9 to counting. The fraud wouldn't be possible. And then the other solution is decentralized social media that you can't clamp down and is censorship free. So at the moment, with everything that's going on in the world, those who believe in freedom, I thought we were making progress after 2016, but we've had a miserable year. But if anything is going to save us, it's the technology, blockchain technology.
I've just had a miserable evening. I placed a bet that you'd mentioned Bitcoin and all of the rest of it in your first intervention, and I lost because you saved it till your second. John, let me come to you. We obviously don't know who will prevail in the USA, but looking at it from our side of the pond, let's assume that we've got President Biden, tainted or untainted. One of the big hopes of this government and a good number of Brexiteers, I think including yourself, was that a trade deal and a closer economic relationship with the USA would be achievable. Do you think that's now for the birds if we have President Biden?
Which John are you after there, Mark?
Sorry, John Longworth, and then I'll go to Phil Tillman.
Right,
sorry.
okay. Yeah, good. Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, the US ambassador to the UK said that even if Biden gets to power, we will have a trade deal. I think one of the the two sides to the US trade deal. One is that a US trade deal, because of the competition it would introduce into the UK economy and the reduction of tariffs, is equivalent to a trade deal with the rest of the world, you could argue, which means it's valuable, very valuable. On the other hand, trade deals in general are not the be-all and end-all. You know, in a post-Brexit Britain, we've still got to remember 70% of the economy is domestic. So actually all the other things that release the economy and cause it to grow that can only be done post-Brexit are as important on the domestic, well, more important on the domestic economy than any trade deals. Mm-hmm. And of course, you can actually get a lot of benefit of trade deals by unilaterally changing the tariff situation, which we can do ourselves whether we have a trade deal or not. So on the one hand, it's desirable, it's the cherry on the icing on the cake of Brexit, but it's not essential. So we shouldn't worry too much if, in fact, it turns out that Biden doesn't give us a trade deal. What's more concerning, of course, is the whole, the whole thing that Dominic was mentioning before, which is about people, the powerful, gathering power to themselves, and actually, that's the biggest threat that's chasing freedom-loving libertarians and democracies in the world. Quite frankly,
John T, what do you make of it? I mean, is it that our politics have just become more and more extreme theatre? And actually, although I followed your election with great interest and on occasions with wry amusement, maybe it doesn't affect me that much, really, whether Biden or Trump's president. And maybe libertarian-leaning people should rather welcome that. Does it really amount to a whole hill of beans? What will change on your side of the pond, or the relationship between your side of the pond and mine? Or is it all just a bit, we got a lot of hyperbole and lots of people getting very upset about things, but life goes on, basically, doesn't it?
Yes, life goes on, but the question is, what is the arc of that life, and will it be a pro-freedom in the classical liberal sense, and will that continue to evolve and grow, or will there be restrictions? I think one of the more disturbing things that's happened during this cycle here is the nature of the American left and the authoritarian nature of the American left. The cancel culture, bullying, intimidation. If you don't agree with the consensus, you can lose your job. A lot of people have lost their jobs because they were Trump supporters. One young lady posted on her Facebook page that she was at a Trump rally. Her employer fired her. These are things where, talk about the lack of consent from the loser. we're having a lack of tolerance for the other, and a little bit on both sides, but I think especially on the left. I just do not see the right with the same level of intolerance as what is developed in the left. And my running joke was, as you may have heard, most of the major cities, downtown areas, all boarded up in anticipation that if Trump won, there would be violence. And there were some people saying, well, no, you don't know that it's because of that. And I said, oh, really? Do you think the Republican women of suburban Glenview, Illinois, are going to be getting in their SUVs and their minivans and cavorting down with the hatchets and axes and ransacking the central business districts of the United States? No, I don't think so. It's Antifa. It's the violent aspects of Black Lives Matter, not the entire movement, of course, because I think most of us would support the cause, if not the organization and some of their tactics. So I think part of the reason I think this is all happening, though, is that what we're seeing is the metastasizing of group identity politics and the end game of it eventually. Because the only way Biden has been competitive, and the only way Hillary was competitive, and the unique unicorn coalition that Obama originally formed, was supermajority proportions and super large turnouts of Blacks, Hispanics, single women, and millennials. That coalition is giving Biden the chance now at taking the presidency. And so the group identity politics requires conflict. The people in the groups are victims, and politicians and the media both profit from conflict in today's world. Media, because that's how you monetize, is by viewership, clicks, and all the rest of it. So you need conflict. And politicians, because it's us against them, and it's become tribal as opposed to unifying. And I don't think we're at the end of this. I think we're in a generational, perhaps multi-generational resetting. I think the really telling story of this election is that the Republicans matched the Democrat wave. You had both parties turned out in record numbers. And I think the Republican Party is becoming the party of the working class and the middle class, the non-elites, the non-highly educated, and rural and exurban. And I think that trend is going to continue.
A real realignment. I see we're joined by Michael Carnuccio, my good friend Michael Carnuccio from the great state of Oklahoma. Good evening, Michael. Great to have you with us. I want your thoughts in just a second. Before then, I'd forgotten to offer my £50 to any of our viewers for my quiz question for this week. Nobody got my snooker question correct. Last week, a good number of you did get correct the question of who was the odd one out between John F. Kennedy, Aldous Huxley, C.S. Lewis, and Doctor Who. The correct answer was Doctor Who was the odd one out. John F. Kennedy, Aldous Huxley, and C.S. Lewis all died on the 22nd of November 1963. Doctor Who, the TV series, was born the next day on the 23rd of November 1963. Our winner was Keegan Curran. We've got your email, Keegan. We will email you to make sure you get the £50. This week's quiz, and I don't want any of our guests, if they know the answer, to shout it out, has an American political flavour. And the question is this. Despite their surnames, what did Trump and Pence achieve in 2016 on the Republican presidential ticket that had not been achieved since 1928? If you know the answer to that question, email the email address lwl@iea.org.uk. And if you get it right, by next week's show, we'll pull one of you out of the hat and I'll give you 50 quid of my hard-earned cash. It's not IEA money. What did Trump and Pence achieve in the 2016 presidential election, despite their surnames, that no Republican ticket had achieved since 1928? Michael, welcome to you. Great to have you back on. I can see you've got a big stars and stripes behind you. Michael Carnuccio from the great state of Oklahoma, founder of Oklahoma City-based JTK Group, which is a strategic leadership coaching firm specializing in fundraising, personal growth, and management. Also the creator and host of The Middle Ground, a weekly television news talk show on Fox in the States. Good evening, Michael.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, great. I can see you more clearly now. For a moment, I thought you were on the moon with the Stars and Stripes flag that had been planted by... I'm sorry. Just your quick take, Michael, on what do you think's unfolding in the States? I mean, we're not particularly involved or interested in the precise electoral process, but is American democracy beginning to fall to pieces a bit? I mean, John was saying that one side might be more to blame than the other, or there's more hostility from one side. But are you now the disunited states of America, whoever finally prevails from the vote yesterday?
Well, I don't know that it's that far gone, Mark, but it is pretty clear, and you've probably had some conversation about this, that the divide between urban and rural communities, voters, socioeconomic environments, the ecosystems there are just becoming so different, and the polarization is quite evident, even down to the tune of communication and mediums in which everyone consumes and engages in the process. And so I do think we're seeing more and more of that. However, there's some interesting outliers that came into play yesterday that I do think answer your question as something we have to understand. The banana peel has been peeled; it's not going back. The fact that such a vast majority of this electorate had engaged in the election 3 weeks prior to the election day, starting to do mail-in votes and absentee, not to the degree we saw before, but to a greater degree. And no matter what comes out of potential challenges and looking at those votes, this isn't going to change. So the old strategies of turn out the vote, drive up, and get to the polls on the day of, which we see the president did to quite an effect, record turnout. If that can be undone, if the last 3 weeks don't matter because so much impact had happened before, this is going to change the way the process works moving forward. And it's going to change how ground games are done and everything else. So I do think we'll see some destabilizing impact from that.
Patrick, let me come back to you. We've touched on this on the show before and in our private conversations. Are we witnessing a realignment? You know, I'm sort of perhaps my head stuck in the kind of Reagan versus Carter, Reagan versus Mondale era. John's touched on some of it, John Tillman, but are we actually seeing the coalitions in electoral politics changing radically before our eyes? And are these actually potentially similar trends on either side of the Atlantic that we've seen? What the Americans would call blue-collar voters here, with a high tendency to vote for the Conservative Party. Affluent London, the Labour Party made gains in. All these things are interesting for think tanks, because if you've got assumptions about what type of ideologies or policy positions or approach people will have given their demographic, if that changes or even goes through a 180, you're in a completely different space. Are we seeing a decisive realignment in American politics and possibly British politics too, Patrick?
I think we are, for sure. I mean, the conventional wisdom for some time has been, as has already been discussed, it's about identity politics. And even if you say, and I think it's at the moment it's now misinformed to say that that's what it's all about, but even if you do, you look at these American elections and you see that Trump has broken into the Hispanic vote considerably, significantly, and among African Americans, he's arguably doubled his take from last time, and he's received more African American votes as a proportion of any Republican since Richard Nixon. And those changes, I suspect, are likely to continue for the reason of the second part of my answer, which is, as John was touching on earlier, and you've touched on, Mark, the realignment is, the irony is, we're actually back to perhaps class-based politics, right? We're back to, maybe it's simplifying to say economically driven, but that's certainly a major piece of the puzzle. So we now have a situation where, in the case of at least the Trump-led Republicans, the appeal is to blue-collar working class people. And the conventional wisdom has been, where that's been accepted, is that yes, they're attracting all of these white blue-collar guys in small towns and rural areas, and they're finding more of them and all the rest. That's why Trump has a shot. But of course, what we discovered last night is that Trump was able to attract blue-collar African-American men, and really significantly in a state like Florida or a state like Texas, working-class Hispanics. So Texas, which was never going to be as close as the Democrats, the media hoped it would be, was nevertheless made quite comfortable for Trump last night, because in West Texas, he absolutely hoovered up working-class Hispanics. And the irony is that when the Republicans, after Mitt Romney's loss to Obama, said, okay, we've lost to two of these in a row now, we haven't won the popular vote in a while, we have to outreach to the likes of Hispanics. Yep. And the working assumption was, well, okay, how do we appease these nice people? What Trump has done, of course, he's come along and said, we don't appease anybody. We just offer them the same as we're offering everybody else. So whether you agree with it or not, or like it or not, his economic platform which is anti-socialist but also pro-tariff, resonates really well with working class people, whether they're Hispanic, Black, or white. So there is a new template for the Republicans, and it does suggest that, like with the knocking down the red wall in Northern England, that the Republicans, like the Conservatives, have, out of necessity, devised a new formula, which, if they can hold on to, appears to be the only way electorally they can compete with their competitors on the left.
Right. John Longworth, let me come to you from your view from this side of the pond about how coalitions and people's voting intentions, and therefore presumably associated to that, their ideologies, their thought processes about politics, or at least their political agendas, are changing. I mean, you were highly successful with the Brexit party in winning a nationwide election almost from scratch. We've seen, I think, a big shift in the demographics that support one party or another, and Brexit perhaps was a cause of that, or it might just have been a reflection of that. What's your take, John, on whether people, we're seeing a realignment of people's approaches and attitudes? And I have to say, this worries me a bit as a kind of free market libertarian. It's not obvious to me whether free market libertarians fit into any of these demographics.
Well, certainly there's an opportunity, and we've actually demonstrated it in the UK, that people will actually get behind politicians who they believe have their interests at heart. And, we saw how Labour in the European elections were completely hammered by the Brexit Party. I mean, I can remember going to Featherstone Working Men's Club, which was rammed to the gunnels, and they were cheering a Conservative politician who was speaking on behalf of Leave Means Leave. So you've got a situation where there's a possibility of people not slavishly following, sort of tribal loyalties, if they're interested in being represented. And of course, there's a huge swathe of people. I mean, I live in the north of England. There's a huge swathe of people in the regions of England who feel that none of the political parties really represent them. And they're actually people who actually believe in Britain, who want to work, and believe in meritocracy and opportunity. The very people, in fact, that Margaret Thatcher, of course, appealed to as White Van Man and Mondeo Man and so on in the 1980s, and was very successful in doing so. Not very fashionable at the moment, but any party that taps into it is going to do very well.
Dominic, help me here. What do madcap libertarians like you and I need to do? Are we just going to be permanently homeless? You've got to write books about bitcoins. I've got to run think tanks. You can do. You're much funnier than I am. You can do the stand-up comedy routine. Or is this realignment potentially an opportunity for? Well, yeah, on Zoom. Is this realignment potentially an opportunity for people who've got pro-freedom, free market ideas to tap into a disillusioned cohort?
Yeah, I'm afraid anyone who believes in free markets and individual responsibility and low tax and all the rest of it is totally politically disenfranchised. Once upon a time, we would have voted for the Conservative Party, but they should rebrand themselves the sort of left-wing social democrat, highly authoritarian control party based on the sort of things they're doing. But there is a solution to all of this. And and again, I'm going to refer to one of my books. I'm going to plug my book, Daylight Robbery. But the central theme of that book is that you shape a society by the way that you tax it. And you determine a society's destiny, whether it will be prosperous or poor, whether its people will be free or subordinated. And my general belief, and there's a lot of pent-up energy. There's a lot of people who want to trade and exchange and generally better their lot. And the more government there is, the less freedom there is, and the less possibility there is to do that. So you've got these two trends. There's a huge people who just generally want to get on with stuff, and then you've got this ever expanding government that's getting in the way. And the really concerning thing, Mark, is the precedents that have been set this year. This new precedent where a government can just close down an economy when it sees fit, and it's done it twice now. And unless there's coronavirus has magically found a cure, it's going to do it again, or it has to admit that it's got stuff wrong and U-turn on its policy. So there's two conflicting forces, but at the moment, the forces for freedom, which were looking so rosy after 2016, have been dealt some mortal blows.
Michael, give me some Oklahoma optimism, for crying out loud. Dominic and I think, agree on virtually everything. But Michael, you're always upbeat. There's always a way through. Well, this is a very American trait, I think, particularly an Oklahoma one. What do you think think tanks like the IA, you know as well, you're a regular visitor here to the IA in London. How should we be changing our message? And I'll ask John Tillman next to try and take advantage of what appears to be an increasing disillusionment with our political state lords and masters, a skepticism about the ability of state and government to do anything productive. Yet we haven't yet managed to marshal that into a coherent force for much more classical liberal free market ideas. Give me some advice, Michael.
Yeah, Mark, I'm reminded too that the last time I had an opportunity to appear here with you, Oklahoma, this was back in, I think, late May, June. We were about to fully reopen our economy coming out of, and we referred to it as the Wild West. Well, we've been open since. And one of the things that became apparent at that time and throughout that I think would apply for you all across the pond, as we say, the turning point in the electorate, and I think in the citizenry across this world, is when they heard, oh, essential jobs can still work, but non-essential, right? We're going to shut everything down. And for the first time, the government was directly telling people what you do for your livelihood, your earned success, how you provide for your family, what you consider as your badge of what you do is non-essential. We do not consider you essential. All these platitudes, everything we talk to you about every 2 or 4 years, and all the cupcakes and kissing babies that we do, we don't believe you're essential. And that has had a shift when you look at the demographic breakdown. In fact, you see here in just the last few weeks here, and we look at exit polls and we see some of the youth vote that is moving. Patrick, and I know John before, talked about some of the demographic breakdowns with the Hispanic vote and African-American vote, but even the youth were breaking because of this lockdown notion, and that their livelihood was not important. So I think anything that think tanks, anything we can do in communicating from the classical liberal perspective about earned success and everyone's right for individual initiative and to provide and to make their livelihood, I think that is a winning solution and a winning message right now.
John Tillman, I see Tom Burrows has said in the YouTube chat, classical liberal think tanks, activists, and other interested parties have got to use the lockdown disaster as a teachable moment. John, if we assume, and I know it's a rash assumption, but I don't think it's too rash assumption, that the same sort of realignments are happening in America and in the United Kingdom, in America partly through the Trumpization of the GOP, perhaps in Britain partly because of the Brexit process. How do think tanks need to reimagine what they're doing to exploit, I don't mind using the word, the disillusion that people are feeling in politics, but to channel that in a positive pro-market way?
I think it's really important to remember that the Trumpization of the is not that way, even though it seems so obviously to be so. What Trump did is he picked up the reins of the dormant Tea Party movement. This all began long before this cycle, and it all began long before Trump, and frankly, it began before 2009. And it started on the right, but then you had the Occupy Wall Street on the left, where they had some common ground in terms of what they didn't like. And what they did not like is the elites deciding how they should live their lives, making policy decisions that were in fact destroying their lives. And the way we should all think about it is, and Michael touched on this a little bit, but what you have really is a competition between the left, which appeals to its voting blocks and gets its political power through grievance culture and grievance, and then encouraging dependency. The government is here to take care of you. The world is unfair. Those other people over there have unfair advantages. We're going to put our foot on the scale and make things right for you. We're going to allocate opportunity. We're going to allocate resources to you, and we're going to respect your grievance and get justice for your grievance. That's their argument. That has a limited upside in the long run, and I think we started to see that today with those movements of the numbers that Patrick and others talked about earlier. And so, what is the antidote to that? The antidote to that is opportunity. The antidote to that is independence. The antidote to that is to pursue your art, pursue your freedom, use your imagination, most importantly, free will. Yes, there's more risk to that, but the unleashing of the human spirit is much more powerful with that argument. And that is why you saw such a difference in the Trump rallies. I'm sure you saw that across the pond, all the Trump rallies and their exuberance. These are people that feel like they're being respected, that their lifestyle is being respected, and they're being unleashed. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us in this. And I think it's really incredible. Whatever you think of Trump, the fact that he's in the hunt, whether he pulls it out or not, or Biden prevails, but they picked up seats in the U.S. House. They held the Senate. These are incredible results given the cultural narrative by our betters, and the fact that it turned out the way it did, I think is really a miracle.
I want to go through all of you guys for your optimism rating. You can apply it to your side of the pond, or indeed humanity in general. Lots of challenges, very, very strange period of time. I kind of had in my mind in Britain that the world would revert to normal once we determined who was going to win the 2019 general election, and then obviously COVID hit. And similarly, I wondered whether in America that there could be a reversion to normal, but I guess whoever prevails ultimately, whether it's Biden or Trump, we've got ongoing problems there. But from a classical liberal free market perspective, how optimistic are you feeling about your country and why over the course of the next 2 or 3 years? Patrick, let me start with you.
If I'd slept, I might say a 3, but I haven't, so it's at best a 2. I just see very little to be encouraged about. It seems that we're on the defensive in an intellectual sense, and even day to day in a political sense too. I don't think it's over, but it's certainly time to regroup and reassess.
Dominic, I don't know. You're sort of an upbeat pessimist, is the way I think of Dominic. So, how are you feeling about the prospects for our ideas?
I'm not very positive, Mark, but I can see the solution. If only other people could see it as clearly as I can. But I'm going to agree with Patrick. I'm going to say 2. I think we're in the middle of a huge culture war, a political civil war, and this election in America hasn't resolved anything, and 2019 didn't resolve anything in the UK. It's ongoing. It's 1941, 1940, something like that, in the ongoing political culture war. But the solution, like if you ever watch a zombie film, the solution is always to find patient zero, the place where the virus originated. If you can get to patient zero, that gives you the antidote, or you kill patient zero and you kill off the zombie virus. And for me, patient zero is the tax system, and it's something you can reform. Everybody agrees that tax needs reform, and it's something you can address without having to get involved in the political and culture wars. You just go straight for the tax system, you fix that, you shape a nation's destiny. And that, to me, is what any political party that wants to actually achieve real change, that's where they should be focusing their effort.
Okay, that was a
tax system.
That was a pretty upbeat too, Dominic. Thanks for that one. let me finish on this side of the pond. John, how are you feeling in terms of optimism next 2 or 3 years in terms of freedom and prosperity? And then I'll go to John Tillman and Michael from their view from their side of the pond. John L.
Okay, well, if we look in 3 years, fixing the Treasury, actually the tax system would be a good idea. Fixing the Treasury and getting them out of their mindset would be a fantastic starting point. But I'm quite optimistic. Entrepreneurs are optimistic. I'm going to give it a 9.
Wow.
And I'll tell you why. Because entrepreneurs are relentlessly positive and actually fix things despite politicians and despite events. And we've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the UK. 83% of businesses are family owned or family run. And also citizens have a habit historically of fixing their leaders if they get it wrong and if they go too far and if they don't listen. And actually in democracies, it doesn't necessarily take decades and hundreds of years to do that. So even over a 3-year period, I'm optimistic.
Okay, beat that, America. John Tillman, let me go to you. How optimistic are you feeling? Obviously, we don't know the outcome of this election, or at least as importantly, the fallout of this election and what that might mean to the states. But 3-year time horizon, so within this presidential period, how optimistic are you feeling about the states? John T.
I remain very optimistic despite all the short-term challenges we're going to have. And I also am a 9, and I'll give you why for either scenario. If Trump wins, we'll see the continuation of the pro-growth policies, the championing of the individual, the constitutional respect and reverence, the ongoing remaking of the court system. All these things have both short-term and long-term impacts. And also, he's just been, as much as he's got all the problems that we're all very familiar with, he has been a fearless warrior against the cancel culture and political correctness, which I think is an essential part of the culture war. If he loses and Biden becomes president, 2022 is going to be the greatest midterm rebuttal we've seen in the history of my lifetime. It'll make 2010 look like a marshmallow time. So either way, we're going to be in a better place and soon.
Michael, your take.
Yeah, I am close to a 9 in the football analogy in the States. I'd say we're not in the red zone, but we're past the 50-yard line running downhill. I'm that kind of enthusiasm as well. And here's why, to the points that I think John made a little bit. What has happened during Trump's first term and what we have seen, especially going into this election cycle, is you have seen turnout and engagement from typical groups that have not been paying attention. They haven't felt their voice matters, that no one's speaking for them. And that doesn't go away in a month. People don't get that engaged and spend those years and realize opportunity and have a stake in the future of their community or country and then just turn the TV on and watch something else afterward. I don't think that's going to happen, especially when the alternative is that the oppression and the state coming down on them and trying to clamp them back and shut them down. I think we'll make, as John said earlier, if Biden wins, the Tea Party ×2, you'll start to see that come about. And because of that, I'm quite optimistic about the opportunity ahead. I've always said, running an American think tank, the best fundraiser that we ever had from 2000 until now was Barack Obama in the White House.
Yeah, I've often had this theory as well that the worse things get for the UK, the better things get for the IEA. So so I've got to kind of choose between my country and my think tank. It's pretty hard trade-off. Was that a 9 from you as well, then, Michael? Just to be clear on the number.
Put me up at a 9 because I can't be outdone.
A 9. Okay. Well, I was feeling a bit optimistic. I'm tired. I'm a bit like Patrick. That I probably would give a higher score if I was feeling a little bit more rested. I think I'm probably a 6. And I think I'm right in saying that between us all, that's I'd be higher than a 6. But the disastrous news this week that Danny Ings, Southampton's centre forward, is injured for 6 weeks. I'm furious about it. I've got a legal team demanding a recount on those 6 weeks, by the way. If we can get it down to 3, I should be all right. But I'm going to go for a 6. That means the overall Live with Littlewood optimism barometer this week is 5.45 recurring. So we tend to keep things at least above average, even with our rather phlegmatic, downbeat UK approach to things. My huge thanks to John T, Dominic, Michael, John L, Patrick for joining the show. Thanks to my earlier guests, Richard Tice, Brendan O'Neill, Jonathan Kitson, and Annabel Denham. It's been a pleasure having you all, gentlemen. Hope to speak to you soon. Perhaps in 6 or 8 weeks' time, we can actually do a post-mortem and talk about who did actually do that this time round.
It'd be great.
But it's been great to have you all. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thanks to all of you for watching on YouTube. If you haven't done already, please hit subscribe, hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed the show. That helps spread the channel on YouTube. To find out more about the IEA, go to our website, iea.org.uk. And if you've got any money to spare, we'd appreciate a donation. And to remind you of the quiz question, if you want to earn £50 of my hard-earned cash, what did Trump and Pence achieve in 2016, despite their surname, that no Republican ticket for the presidency had achieved since 1928? If you think you know the answer to that, email lwl@iea.org.uk. And the one we draw out of the hat, 50 hard-earned pounds in sterling, that will be yours. Gentlemen, thanks again. Thanks to our audience. Been a pleasure hosting with you. Keep upbeat, stay safe, stay free. Over and out.